Uh, Another good one because I am able to interview yet a second person who I met 20 plus years ago while working for Starbucks. And I've been following her journey over the course of 20 plus years on social media. And much like me, Jen Layte shows up in service to others, has consistently done that for as long as I've known her. And so I have her on today to share her journey. She is a pastor, an author. She is the founder of the Pilgrimage, which is the community that really supports people who have religious trauma but are still, spiritually connected, so to, or Jesus, right? And wants to build that spiritual relationship. So, Jen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. This is awesome.
It is. I just have to figure out why my phone connected to laptop. You can disconnect to remove this phone from the Mac microphone. Yeah, disconnect because I don't want you to. Well, we'll see if that recorded, and if not, they're gonna figure out who you are through my messaging. So, all right, guys, you know how I roll, unedited and raw, and this is how we do it. So, as I mentioned, Jen is a pastor, but she recently relaunched a book. And so can you talk to me about how what prompted you to write a book in the first place and why the relaunch?
So I have always been interested in writing, actually, since I was 4 years old. My mom was reading a story to me and it had these great pictures and it was this really great story that I loved. And I was like, I want to do that. And so that's been part of who I am for almost as long as I can remember. And in around the time that you and I met, I was actually working on another book that did get traditionally published in 2008. So it's a children's novel about a refugee kid from Kosovo in London in the 90s, because I used to work with refugees in London in the 90s. So so it's fiction, but it is about like real types of situations that people were encountering during that time period. That was when there was the conflict between the Serbs and the Kosovar people in the former Yugoslavia. So anyway, that journey was maybe a little too easy for me. And so, because I knew some people who knew people, and so this little publishing company in Scotland picked it up, and it didn't do very well as far as sales and people getting to know about it, but I got a publishing deal real quick. And so therefore I did not realize everything that's involved in trying to get a book deal. So in a similar time frame, I was also working on this other book. It was a novel. It doesn't really have a genre. Sometimes I call it a spiritual memoir through someone else's story because basically what I did was I took the person of Jesus' mother, Mary. I'm not Catholic, so I don't have the same view of her as Catholics do, but I do think that she is worthy of respect and also worthy of some investigation. And so I basically imagined myself as her. I didn't try to do a ton of I did some research on the time period and definitely on some, probably not enough research on Jewish understandings of that time period, but I tried to do some. But mostly I just imagined myself as her, and then I reread the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as if I were her, and I'm trying to imagine what it would feel like to be Jesus' mom while all this crazy stuff is happening with your son, right? And so I wrote a whole novel. It's 300 plus pages from her point of view. But obviously, I think most writers know this. You write from the place that you are, right? So I would say now I finished writing that in 2010. Um, and there, if I were going to rewrite it, or if I were going to write it for the first time now, I would probably do it a little differently because I'm in a different place in my life. And but there's still, I feel like there's still a lot of value in it, and people that read it absolutely love it because they might be familiar with the stories that it's telling, but not in the way that I tell them.
Yeah.
So I tried to find a book, tried to get a book deal for that, but I didn't really have a lot of know-how because of my first experience. And um, I didn't know how to pitch. Well, okay, let's be honest. I don't really know how to pitch anything, but I didn't know how to pitch a book that didn't really fit a category.
Yeah.
Um, the furthest I got was a literary agent wanted to look at it, and she said, "This is really well written, but I feel like you either need people who are completely unfamiliar with the stories or people who are much more familiar with the stories than I am to be able to tell if it's a good book or not." And so she didn't feel like she was equipped to promote it to publishers. So then I just kind of threw it in a box. And then in well, actually, when I started the pilgrimage online, that organization, I thought, there's a couple people I'm working with who might find this story useful. So I'll just print it up for them. So I printed it up for them, and then they started getting really excited about it. So in 2019, I published it myself.
Wow.
And some people bought it, but now I am trying to get another book published, and it also has biblical content. It's also an unusual way of retelling the biblical content. It's not a novel in this case. It's about Jesus' disciple Peter, and it's about identity, actually. But I know a lot more about what is needed for traditional publishing, but I'm not, once again, it doesn't really fit very tidily into a genre. And so the kinds of feedback I'm getting, um, some people are like, this is too conservative, and other people are like, this is too progressive. And oh, and I'm like, I'm just not gonna be either of those things, probably. Um, and but across the board, everyone says your platform's not big enough. And
Mm.
so I had some friends, and they said, well, why don't you take the book that's already out there and start promoting that so people know what your stuff is about? So that's kind of why I relaunched it around Christmas time.
Yep.
It starts with the Christmas story. And so it was a really nice season for people to read it. And there's actually somebody right now who really liked it, a man, by the way. This is not only a book for women. um, and he knows some agents, and he's like, I know this book you already self-published, but it should be published, like traditionally published. So he's actually trying to get that um, out there a little bit more. So,
I love that so much. So there's a couple things I want to highlight. One, you definitely know how to promote because you're individual. And that's what I love about you. So you said, well, I guess I don't fall into this category. But if you really think about it, for as long as I've known you, you've been authentic, like uniquely you, right? And that's something that takes a lot of people a long time to discover, if ever, to just step into who they are
mm-hmm,
unapologetically, which is one
mm-hmm,
of the reasons I felt called to interview you, because you're the exact person I want my community to meet. You have your own unique story, your own unique beliefs, and that, to me, there's so much power in individuality. So I did
yeah.
want to highlight that. So you mentioned your books are based on spiritual beliefs. I don't know if
Mm-hmm,
it's a specific religious ideology. As long as I've known you, you've had a very strong faith. And in fact, when you and I worked together, I did not have the same faith I do now, because life
mm-hmm.
tends to, if you continue to do the
It
work,
does.
you can't help but find your spiritual side. But can you
For
talk to
sure.
me about
how you grew up spiritual, like, because has it always been embedded into you, which I imagine because of your parents, and then how that has played an instrumental role in who you are today?
Yeah, totally. It's actually sort of underpins the my third book that I'm trying to get out into the world. Um, so I, well, I should say I feel like I'm much less dogmatic about my faith than I was when you and I first met. I'm much more able to let people be where they are, but I am still like Jesus is kind of an obsession. He's probably become more of an obsession as time has gone on. But yeah, I definitely started out that way. My parents are very religious, spiritual. They both really love Jesus. My dad was, well, they both um, were missionaries for a few years when I was really little, and then they came back and they started a church here in central Massachusetts. And that's always been part of my life, but I never chafed against that the way a lot of pastors' kids do, because they were very authentic. They were sure not perfect, but I mean, you remember meeting them. They're gentle and they really take their faith seriously, and so they know the tenets of the faith, but they also live them out.
Yeah.
And Jesus was always really real to them, so it didn't seem like a stretch to me that he was real.
Yeah.
And I remember, I have pretty early memories, and I remember some of my thoughts about God from when I was little. But my mom also recorded because I was super verbal, super early, shocker. And so she has like there's a photo album and she would write little funny things that I said too. And one of them was, I guess I was 3, and I said, I love the Lord Jesus. I love him. He is my favorite friend. He made the blue sky and the moon that shines so high, and he loves me.
Oh.
And that was like, nobody told me to do that.
Yeah.
Um, so, and actually, right now, this isn't the house I grew up in, but this was my parents' second house in central Massachusetts. They've moved out to Minnesota because my brother's family's out there. But they sold my husband and me this house in 2018, and I discovered a drawing, which I'll send you a file of it, that I made when I was 6, I guess, or 7 or something, and it's Jesus. He's almost at the edge of the paper, like it's really bad layout, but um, he's almost at the edge of the paper, and then there's little blonde me following him, and
Wow.
yeah, so he's just always been a big deal. Um, in my 30s, which is when we met, he and I were kind of having a fight. And so um, I'm sure you remember me being really intense about talking about my faith at Starbucks, which
Very,
not,
very intense. Yes.
not so sure how appropriate that was anymore. But anyway, I was. Um, but actually, during that time, I was really unhappy with the trajectory of my life and with God. And
Yeah.
there was one day when I came home from work, and I said to God, I was like, I don't know why I'm trying so hard. I don't even want to believe in you right now. And I felt like I don't hear voices. Some people say they hear God talking. I don't hear that, but I do get, sometimes I get like actual sentences in my head that I didn't
Yeah.
think of. And I felt said, that's because I got you. And one of the things I was fighting with God about was I felt like I had given my life to him in working with refugees in London. And then God told me, I still don't know if he really did this, but I felt like God told me to come back to the United States and then just didn't tell me what to do next, just dropped me. And so when God said, I got you, that was a turning point. Um, and so
In
there
your
have been
faith.
ups and downs in my life since then, but that that was kind of my dark night of the soul season.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting because I read Mother Teresa's like works, and she talks about, being called to do the work that she did, but then felt like God abandoned her. And every day she would preach and preach, but internally she was in a struggle for the rest of her life that's really intense.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I love that you said that you were kind of in a fight with God, because I think we all go through that. Once you have faith, it's like step out and trust. But then you feel like you fall flat on your face and like smack pavement. But somehow you just endure. And I think that's really how you continue to expand and deepen your faith, is because what is seemingly insurmountable, even though while you're in it, it's arduous, you end up like moving through the hard. And then when you look back, the growth and the understanding and just the profound sense of resilience and self-confidence, as well as confidence in something bigger than you, grows.
Right.
So
totally.
I think of Galil Gibran. He says, just as he crowns you with love, so does he crucify you. Yeah, that's real. So
Yeah.
So all right. So
Yeah.
we work together at Starbucks. We obviously part ways because that's the way life is. And then I find out you become a pastor. So how did that come about? Because that's not an easy transition. I can't even imagine.
Yeah. Well, it's not like I went Starbucks to pastor. that probably I would have crashed and burned. But I did go Starbucks to, I started working at a church up the road from Starbucks in Greendale as my job title was Christian education director, which is basically like a youth pastor, but also in charge of any other Christian education that happens in the church that's not the preaching on Sunday morning. So the Sunday school for the kids and all that stuff. And adult Bible studies if people wanted them, which when I first got there, they didn't really, but by the time I left, there were a few adults who were interested in that kind of thing. And actually the pilgrimage online sort of started as an offshoot of that, the stuff that I was doing with the adults at the end there. But I was there for almost 7 years, and it was not the easiest assignment. Fortunately, I was in a much better place with God, because I don't think I could have sustained some of the stuff that went on there. And the leadership changed a lot over the 7 years. And so most of the time I worked really well with them, but the last pastor essentially didn't trust me. And I don't work well with people that don't trust me, because I try really hard to be trustworthy and a team player, even though I'm, like you say, I'm pretty individual. But so after that, it was time to leave. And then I got kind of bullied for a while until I actually did leave. So that was another, like, that's kind of my second, not quite dark night of the soul, but piece that was really hard in the life of faith. And so after that, I had finished seminary, but I wasn't planning anymore to become a pastor. I actually wanted to teach. And so, but I didn't know what I was going to do next. So I ended up taking a training course to become a chaplain and a training course to become a spiritual director at the same time, which is a little bit insane and also expensive when you just lost your source of income. But but this is maybe trite to say, but God provided, because I got through, it was 2 years of training for both of those things, and I got through both of them, and I had my seminary degree. So now I'm a advanced practice board certified chaplain, a certificated spiritual director, and an ordained pastor. but I
And
wasn't
what's the
planning to be
difference for the audience out there? Because I don't even know, like, what are
okay.
the differences between those?
Super great question. Super great question. I actually came up with a little chart, which I don't know where I filed it. Otherwise, that might help me explain. Um, but it's sort of a difference in levels of um, directness. So, like a pastor of a church, which that's later, we're still getting to that part of my story, but a pastor of a church is somebody who's going to proclaim what they believe is the truth to a congregation of people who are consenting to be there. So they're all in the same place and they're all there for essentially the same reason. The people are there to learn, and I am being, if I'm preaching, I'm being direct about what I think this passage of scripture means, um, and that kind of thing. And I visit people, but I'm visiting as their pastor, and so they are part of my community, and we share certain understandings, and also we share a community together. Um, Spiritual direction is probably the worst named discipline ever because it's very indirective. The idea, at least I was trained by the Anglicans. There are different training programs, but as far as generally Christian spiritual direction goes, I think they're more or less the same. Is that the spiritual director and the directee, the other person, are in the room with God. So that God is the third person in the room. And the spiritual director's job is to facilitate the interactions between the other person and God, to help clear away all the gunk that flies around in our heads that mixes us up and that kind of stuff. And so when I am someone, I have a spiritual director myself, lifesaver. I am, whenever I'm going through something, I'm like, when is my next appointment? Because yeah, very not, it's not the same thing as therapy either. Very little advice giving, very little actual direction, more listening, asking questions. Sometimes there's silence. Like I will say, okay, you just said a whole bunch. Let's sit in silence and see what comes up for you. If does anything, do you feel like there's anything else you need to say, or is God saying something to you about this right now? Or what would happen if you asked God this? Why don't you just do it? And so we're kind of, it's a lot of listening. Listening and questions, and not much self-disclosure, not much on the director's part, and not much like information or teaching or that kind of thing. And then chaplaincy is the least directive, and it is interfaith. With spiritual direction, a person is coming to you. They are usually paying you, the director, for their session. They are seeking you out. So again, it's still kind of their initiative. But chaplaincy is different because most people, every once in a while, you'll get a person who will ask for a chaplain in a hospital or something like that. But most people won't. And so you make a lot of cold calls and you say, I'm part of your healthcare team and I'm here to support you in your emotional well-being and whatever your spiritual beliefs are, just to help you cope with what you're going through better. And some people love it and other people are like, no. And that, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because my father had a health scare, and this is somebody who I mean, I know he grew up in the church, but like he's not practicing, but he definitely appreciated the chaplain coming on around and just checking in on him. So okay, so you go on this I mean, I imagine it's a spiritual quest for yourself, though, too, as you're going through these trainings, right? It's
Totally.
forcing you to really examine your relationship with
Yep.
God. And so then now you finish all this training and you're like, what? I'm going to run a church? Is this how it works? Let us know.
No. So was I was training as a spiritual director because I already had this idea of the pilgrimage online in my head. And I actually started that a few months after I got let go / resigned from that church. And part of why I formed it was because I was just freshly out of my own experience of church hurt. And I was aware of more and more people who were struggling with the church and sometimes with God, but like problems in church. And this was before, I mean, they're even more overt now, I would say, but even in 2015, stuff was ramping up. So I wanted to do more than spiritual direction through the pilgrimage. I wanted to teach courses. I wanted to host retreats. But I also knew that spiritual direction would be kind of the underpinning skill that I would need to do that. And so that I started almost right away. The pilgrimage is mostly, some of the services I offer have a price tag associated with them, but it's mostly funded by donations. So I had to get all that stuff set up in place. So I didn't really start doing anything with it until the following year. But so that was already happening. And then the chaplaincy training requires internships. And so the first 2 units of chaplaincy, I did internships at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester. And then I found some online chaplain training where they said your practice points come from you getting an actual job as a chaplain. So it just so happened that there was a small hospice in southern Worcester County that was looking for a spiritual care person. And so I applied and they were like, not finding a lot of people. They were like, yep, please join us. And so that was a really great fit. It was a part of a visiting nurses association. So I wasn't stuck in one building. I was visiting people in their homes at end of life. I learned a ton through that. And I did that for 2.5 years. And I thought, yeah, this is my calling. I can do the pilgrimage half-time and I can do hospice chaplaincy half-time, and I'm good. But
That's not the way it works.
that's right. So every so often, because I had connections in churches from my former job, there were like 3 churches in the area that would sometimes invite me to speak on a Sunday morning if their pastor was away or whatever. So this one church invited me in 2016, and I really liked them, and my husband Paul really liked them, but we didn't know what their situation was, except that they were really poor and they had dwindled down to like less than 20 people. I got invited there because our connection goes back a long ways, but before that, I worked at Old Sturbridge Village.
Yeah, I
And
remember that. Oh my gosh, yeah.
and this woman that I worked with there is a member of this church. And so she had invited me. Anyway, so that was 2016. Never got invited back, forgot about them. Then my husband and I bought this house in 2018. And we thought, before that, planning to move, but we thought we'd move to like New Hampshire or something. And after my parents offered us this house and we bought it, Paul, my husband, says, hey, maybe now that we're staying here, you can pastor that nice little church in Southbridge. And I was like, nah, dude, they called me once and it was like 2 years ago. I don't know anything about them. Like that week, my friend from there called and said, hey, we have an opening on Sunday in July. Can you come and preach for us? So I did. loved it again. And at the end of the service, she said, "Would you consider applying to be our pastor?" And I was like, I thought about it for a second and I was like, I've never made much money anywhere. But I was finally making like a decent wage as a hospice chaplain. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so. I can't, I know these guys can't pay me anything. And I just don't think it's financially viable. We have all these responsibilities, whatever. And I said, I would have to join the denomination, right? And she was like, well, yeah, that would be expected. And I wasn't part of any denomination, any Christian denomination. I'm a Christian, and I don't really, that's the only distinguisher that that's the only thing I care about. I don't care about Baptist or Anglican or Catholic or like, because Jesus is the point to me. So, so she was like, well, yeah, we would expect that. And I was like, I just don't feel like I need to officially join any denomination. Plus, every single one of them, because I had already looked into this, has 8,000 hoops that you have to jump through to be part of their denomination as a pastor. And I was just like, I don't want, I'm just going to serve Jesus how I serve Jesus. And so I left, I went home, but then I'm like, hey, hun, funny thing. She just said, what if you applied? And he was like, well, yeah, maybe we should think about it. And we talked about it a little bit. And then we both said, nah. Well, here's the way that God does stuff with me. God puts an opportunity in front of me, and I'm like, absolutely not. And then God's like, okay, and just keeps holding it there until I'm finally like, okay, fine. We'll see what happens. So I applied, except I said I wasn't planning to be a pastor. I'm content with what I'm doing, but I really like this congregation, and I would be honored to be the pastor of this congregation as long as I don't have to formally join the denomination. I will be ordained, but I want the congregation to ordain me, not the bigger organization.
Yeah.
And I said, if that's a deal breaker, you can just throw my application in the trash. Well, yeah. Clearly it was not a deal breaker. So I've been there for 5 years, and that means that I was there for a year and then COVID hit. And
oh God,
that was also quite the learning curve.
Yeah.
It hasn't been easy, but fortunately, I know from being a pastor's kid that there is no easy pastorate. And yeah, overall, it's been really good. And I still love the church. And
is it growing?
Yes, but not fast. It took us forever to break 25. And now we're at around 40, almost 40. We could, if everybody showed up, we'd probably be at 50.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so I think for me, right, so obviously the community knows I'm super spiritual. I've studied everything from the Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, to, some of the Bible, the Quran. Definitely that did not sit well with me in some of ways. But I also, despite being very spiritual, have some reservations around church and religion, specifically because of the trauma that I continuously learn about. And so can you talk to me about the pilgrimage, and then, what is the overall belief of for you, right, and then church that you serve with regard to Jesus? And I'll share my opinion after, but I'm just curious.
Those are big questions. So
I'm a big questioner.
I know. I love these. I mean, this is kind of what I live for. So the pilgrimage is Pretty much anything I do is for anybody who wants it. I always say that. I don't believe in putting walls up. Like, we may not see eye to eye on everything, but um, what I'm finding is that when the pilgrimage started, it mostly was people that, like, my friends from church that knew about it, and so they they would come to some of my programs and they found them super helpful, but most of those people were still actively involved in a church, and so it didn't have quite the same impact that it's having now. In 2020, I was on Twitter, and it was a little weird, but this whole pseudo Christian community formed on Twitter, like across a spectrum of understandings about social issues and political issues and stuff like that. But everybody was kind of had Jesus in common. As time has gone on, that same community, they're not as tight anymore, because some people are like, yeah, I'm just done with the whole Jesus thing, everything, absolutely everything that I grew up in. And other people are like, oh, I still want to stay connected to Jesus, but I just can't do the church thing anymore. Can't read the Bible anymore, not really sure about praying. And so I still pray, and I still read the Bible, and I still love Jesus. And somehow I don't actually even really totally understand what draws people to my programs. And I have to say, it still takes a lot out of me to I actively recruit people. But there are people that come to, for example, we have a twice a month Wednesday morning Bible discussion. It's not a standard Bible study. We read the Bible together, and everybody in that group is people that are like, I can no longer read the Bible by myself, but I love this group because we talk about this stuff together. We can ask whatever question, and we can notice things. We're noticing things in here that we never noticed before because our pastors never told us. So it's a safe place for people to bat around their ideas. I do very little, I mean, as a spiritual director in a session, but also in the Bible studies and the classes, I do very little like telling people what they have to think, if at all, if at all. Everybody knows that I'm about Jesus, and that we will engage the Bible, and that we'll probably pray every so often, but there's no agenda. I just want people to come out more whole, and feeling like they're connected with some community. If it's not a church, here's this little community that you traveled with online for a while, that you all know something about each other that other people don't know. You have this experience of closeness that other people don't have. And so, yeah, people find it quite powerful. My personal beliefs about Jesus are that I do believe that God is a personal God, and that God exists in three persons. I'm going to use the masculine term, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that Jesus is the human incarnation of God. And so by seeing what Jesus is like, we understand what God is like.
So
if you want to know,
essentially, for
yeah,
for anybody who, Jesus was unconditionally loving.
yes,
And there is where I stand too. And I think there's this huge narrative. I believed it for a long time. I figured I was burning in hell. You know what I mean?
mm-hmm.
I was having sex at 14. I did drugs. I went through all of this trauma, and then you hear, oh my God, you're such a sinner. But I have to tell you, from everything that I've studied, both from theology, but also physics, right? From the
Mm-hmm.
energetic vibration standpoint, which if you study science, and I'm obsessed with it
Mm-hmm.
because it proves that we live in a conscious universe, that love actually operates at a much higher frequency than fear. And so it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make any sense that God or Jesus would be punitive. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where so many people have this belief system that honestly makes them either believe that they're bad and or they should fear where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where what I want to dispel. You know what I mean? Because I
Mm-hmm.
know for a fact from my own experiences is this not true.
Yeah. I actually just preached a sermon about that on Sunday. I'll send you the link.
You should.
Just
Yeah, and it's interesting because you know that I'm like 2.5 minutes from Southbridge. I live in Thompson, Connecticut. So
Oh,
maybe I'll
really?
pop into one of your
Yeah, you should
one of
visit
your
sometime.
yeah. So well, I love all that. And I think again, you know, I really want to have you on because of the book, because I think that something I've always appreciated about you, much like myself, we've always been unique. Like take us or leave us, but we're not really somebody who's going to conform to the
Nope.
expectations of anybody, right? Our
Right.
boss. Hi, Frank. And or anybody else, right? And as a result, I mean that creates friction at times, right? But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, it really does attract to you who it is you're meant to serve, you know. And
Yes,
something
that's
I
right.
love about the pilgrimage is where there is two or more, there is God. And I tell
Mm-hmm.
people that all the time. Whether you believe in God or not, the reality is when you're in connection and communion, connection with people, you know, you tap into an energy that you wouldn't otherwise be
Mm-hmm.
able to connect with because we are interconnected, we're woven.
Yep.
And you know, since COVID, the disconnection and the dis-ease and the mental
Mm-hmm.
anguish that is so
Mm-hmm.
prevalent, not even just within the United States, globally,
Right.
is
Globally.
continuing to rise. And even now more than ever, I think it's so important that there are places, whether it's you know, around spirituality or just a place where you can gather so that you can
Mm-hmm.
have these conversations, because that's where the healing happens,
That's
even
right.
if you're not completely bought in. So I really appreciate
Right.
that you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's global. We have a once a year online retreat in January. And so we just had it, and there was a woman in Norway who attended it, even though in her time zone it was like 1 o'clock in the morning when it started. Um, and the Wednesday morning Bible discussion group this past week, there was a guy in India who joined us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's so and I'll share, like I told you earlier, I have studied an immense amount, not just Jesus, right? Buddha, like Paramahansa Yogananda, like there are great spiritual avatars in all areas of the
Mm-hmm.
world, and all of them, if you strip down all of the narrative, it's all about love. Sin is actually to error. Error is a separation from God, and the
Mm-hmm.
separation is lack of love. And really, to even go even further on my little tangent, it's lack of self-love. Because I truly believe that if you love yourself, it is unequivocally impossible not to love somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like when you strip down all the narratives, all the beliefs, all the habits that we've been conditioned and bought into, when you learn yourself, but in a very intimate way, which I do believe you learned with Jesus and or
Mm-hmm.
any other spiritual person that you're aligned with, when you love yourself that much, it is truly impossible not to love unconditionally anybody, because
Mm-hmm.
there's no agenda. It's just to show up and be in in service and of space with people. So anyway,
Yep.
is there anything you would like to leave the community with before I hit end on this recording?
I should have thought of something really wise and pithy to say. Well, this isn't wise or pithy, but I teach a course on, and it obviously, because everything I do comes from a Christ-centered perspective, but it's on stages of faith. And stages of faith are traceable in multiple religions. We use as our kind of, there's a lot of reading in this particular course, as our core text, we use a 16th century Roman Catholic nun's book, Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle. And so we use that kind of as our foundation for the idea of stages of faith. I feel like knowing about those is so helpful when you're going through life because it gives you language and a framework when you're going through something and you're like, why does my life feel totally different now than it did right then? Why am I doing so much better spiritually, or why am I struggling so hard spiritually? Well, maybe because this is a stage that most people go through if they are being intentional about their spirituality. And so that course starts on, I want to say May 8th for the evening course, and May 10th, there's a Friday morning course. And if people are interested, they should go to the pilgrimage website that I think you are posting, and they can sign up for it there. Or if they want to ask me questions about it, I'm super accessible. Just, I'd love to welcome anybody on that journey with us.
I love that. All right, guys. As I mentioned,